This podcast is inspired by the work of Francis Schaeffer, who wrote a book and made a film series called How Should We Then Live that had a big influence on me and lots of other people in the 70s and 80s and probably even into the 90s. And I hope this podcast has the same effect for you. It'll energize you, educate you, and equip you to live a truly great life. Well, it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome to these conversations John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister, a man who many of us look up to as elder statesman, Christian leader, thinker, now somewhat of a public intellectual, interviewing fascinating people from around the world to bring important ideas back into our lives so that we can live and think more effectively in the world. And he's a man who I count as a friend and have the utmost respect for, and I'm delighted to have this conversation about all things anti-Semitism, all things Jewish, all things Israel, and we'll see where we go. So, John, thank you very, very much for being part of this.
Mark, it's a delight, and I salute the hard work that you are doing to try and help us understand slightly more humanly the dangers that confront us.
What do you think has changed in Australia when you think of where the Australia you grew up in, the Australia you helped to lead, and where we are now? What are the most striking changes, particularly with regard to the whole way we treat each other and in particular Jewish people?
I'm a great fan of G.K. Chesterton, to whom the remark that when we stop believing in God, we don't start believing in nothing, we start to believe anything. And I can't believe the extent to which we will now fall for propaganda, to be honest. So the two great features that I think have flown into the void that has been left by the desertion of our belief system, and with it, the ignorance of history, and nowhere is that more evident than in the current debate over Israel. What has actually happened is that we have firstly lost any common sense of a common compass, moral compass. The second is that we are so easily persuaded that I can't help being reminded of Marx's remark that once you strip your history away from people, they are easily persuaded. And that's what we're seeing at the moment.
So tell me a little bit, when you speak about having lost our moral compass, can you think about how you see that working out with regard to Israel and the events of October 7 and our subsequent response?
Well, I hardly know where to start. The first point I would make is that the age-old observation from intelligent people that the dividing line between good and evil does not lie between man and woman, or people of one race and another race, or one belief system and another belief system. We are all fallible. And this binary approach that we're now seeing from the forces of progressivism that says that everything Israel does is evil, which is so often a front, by the way, for anti-Semitism, or an attempt to hide anti-Semitism. And that in itself is a story, because the 20th century was all about, really, the horrors inflicted upon us by true racism. And I think, the other great problem that we have is this lack of ability to think clearly. So we're taken by emotion all the time, feelings. As Ayaan Hirsi Ali puts it, and I've said many times, we are in danger of turning our democracy, and keep in mind Israel is a democracy surrounded by countries that are anything but democratic, but we don't seem to care about that anymore. We don't value democracy and the freedoms it bestows, the opportunity for diversity that it displays. We seem to have rejected all of that, and we've moved to a place where feelings and emotions really have taken the place of cool, calm reason, observance of the evidence, and particularly the evidence from history.
So when I think of that, I think, well, emotions are very manipulable. So propaganda, the big lie, can change people's emotions. And my observation since October 7 is that many, many people in Australia take their history of Israel from October the 8th. So they sort of forget October the 7th, and then all the emotions have got engaged around Israel's self defense and Israel's actions in Gaza. What do you think about that?
Well, you saw the outbursts, after um, October the 7th, and those horrific acts, which it must be remembered, again, this is history, would deeply affect people of Jewish background, more so even than the rest of us, because of the horrors of the first real attempt at genocide. The word genocide evolved out of an attempt after the Second World War to describe the horrors of the Holocaust. That's where it came from. Now, if you'd been part of that tradition, that's the first thing. You would understand and be affected by it more deeply, I suspect, than anyone else. And Hamas knew that. They knew that.
Mm,
It was
mm,
carefully planned to be the most provocative thing possible and to reignite, I think, the nightmare of the Holocaust in the minds of Jewish people everywhere. One of the great differences, of course, Mark, is that the Germans basically tried to hide from their own people and the world, and indeed from the Jews themselves, the nature of their intent upon executing the final solution. What was the final solution? Well, we would now call it genocide. The final solution was to rid the world of Jewish people. It should be remembered that many people in the Middle East were conscripted by Hitler. If it hadn't been for the progress that the Allies were making, there would have been vast numbers of Jews. Here's another bit of history that I suspect the kids who were encouraged to march in Melbourne didn't know about, there were many Jews living in the Middle East, and there were many Arab leaders who wanted to cooperate with Adolf Hitler to ship those Jews to Germany, where they'd be told they were going to a work camp. But in fact, they
mm,
would be taken in vast trains, cattle carriages, cattle trucks, basically on wagons, into places like Auschwitz, where they'd be immediately segregated into those that could be used for slave labor until they were dead, and those were to be gassed immediately, including innocent children. If
mm.
you'd been the inheritor, I'm not. Mark, you know more about this than me, of that appalling attempt to wipe out an entire people, you would, of course, instantly recognize how evil it is. Now, the Allies recognized after World War II how evil it was, and the term that we've been discussing that's now thrown around so freely, genocide, was actually worked up to try and describe what the Nazis had done. But
Mm.
Hamas and unfortunately quite a few other terrorist leaders in part of the world are quite happy, unlike the Nazis, to say, free us, from the Jordan to the sea. That's code for the Jewish nation should go. They're quite happy to
Yes.
say, tears of joy flowing down my cheeks when I hear what Hamas has done, and that's before Israel had responded. We've had chanting crowds, F the Jews, gas the Jews. Did those children in Melbourne actually know what was being referenced by the term gas the Jews? I'll bet London to a brick they didn't. Did their teachers know? Did they,
Mm,
if they did know, explain that to the children so they could comprehend the nuancing of it? Or is it even worse, they didn't know?
mm,
The issues raised here point again, as I said at the beginning, to my way of thinking, to a truly frightening loss of moral compass and a truly frightening gullibility. Goebbels was the great pioneer of mass propaganda, of course, as part of the Nazi movement. And he said, tell a lie often enough and people will believe it. Now we have a situation where this is astounding stuff. It's a revolution. That which should be on top is now at the bottom. That which should be on the bottom is on the top. We now have people seriously saying, even South Africa, the country of your birth,
It-
for whatever reason, under pressure from wherever, takes a matter to court, the international court in Europe, to argue that Israel is engaging in genocide. And that's the message, whereas in fact, there's no evidence to suggest that at all. There is open acknowledgement by many of the terrorists that they're intent upon wiping out Israel. And therefore, I would argue, engaging in the most monstrous anti-Semitism. What has happened to us? What does it say about our education? I mean, I hardly know where to start with this.
It is overwhelming, and it feels to me like the discussion that we're having about anti-Semitism in Israel. It's like the thread on the jumper of our whole Western civilization that you start following that thread, and you realize it seems like we are seeing the unraveling of many of the foundations of what's made us who we are as a culture. So, as you were saying, I think um, one of the most disturbing things for me is the moral equivalence that people have tried to draw between what Hamas did on October the 7th. Resistance is justified. This is an act of brave resistance against these terrible colonial oppressors who have run the largest open air concentration camp in the world. There was a sign at a recent rally um, in Sydney that said, if you had been oppressed for 75 years, you'd October 7th as well. So this idea that what they did, what the Hamas did, is justified, and now what Israel is doing is morally no different to what Hamas did. So the response of a independent democratic nation state to defend its citizens is now just the same as the most horrific, uh, barbaric massacre of innocents, raping of children, beheading of children, taking 130 people hostage. This moral equivalence and lack of ability to see what's going on seems incredibly concerning, and doesn't bode well for our future as a country and as a civilization, that we can't see the difference between these two.
I agree entirely. I've said many times, even before this happened, we are at a civilizational tipping point. And here is, in a way, the pointy end of it, in a way that should sober every person still capable of thinking clearly. Every person who is still capable of thinking clearly. We have torn ourselves inside out across the West, starting in America and spreading across the world, in the name of Black Lives Matters and in the name of critical theory, to convince ourselves that the great problem in the world today is racism, and that whites are racist, all whites are racist, and only whites are racist. Racism is, of course, when it's all boiled down, hatred. And frankly, I don't think it makes any difference whether it's between races or between people of exactly the same race or people within a family. Hatred of another human being is at the heart of this broken world that we have. Theologically, you would say hatred of God and hatred of those around you. That's the genesis of what we would call a broken world. The power of evil in our world. Now, what's this got to do with what's happening at the moment? Anti-Semitism is racism writ large. It is hatred of a people based on their race, based on their ethnicity, manipulated down through the ages. This is not new. Shamefully at times by people like Martin Luther, who frankly should have known better. And that was then used by the Nazis during the Second World. Look, our great theologian himself in these latter years, I think he might have been losing it a bit, penned some pretty vitriolic stuff. This is not new, but its resurgence, interestingly, especially amongst the left, and look, there will be people who won't bother listening to our conversation here, who are so lost to their causes, so deeply committed to the destruction of Western democratic capitalism, that any port in a storm, doesn't matter how evil, they will support because it achieves what in their minds is the greater good, the destruction of terrible Western culture, etc., etc., etc. But there are a lot of well-meaning Australians, and in fact, I think Douglas Murray makes this point, who are not thinking clearly. Their education system hasn't equipped them. They haven't learned history. They don't have that, if you like, that sort of community moral compass where we might not have been even churchgoers or thought of ourselves as particularly Christian, but we broadly thought, for example, loving your neighbor, being aware of your own failings, seeking forgiveness, knowing that we were not perfect and binary judgments, you're evil, I'm good. Surely that hasn't washed out of the system to the point where, worryingly, people are taking it in. I make one other point. As we talk now, we've seen very strong reactions from a Prime Minister down, the New South Wales Premier, and so forth, to the re-emergence of some neo-Nazis. Well, to give Mr. Minns some credit, I mean, I think he was one of the stronger ones, although he allowed those initial rallies to go on, which were disgraceful in Sydney. But where has been the condemnation from our top political
Mm.
leadership of the latter day people who stand in the spirit of Nazism? Because the defining feature of Nazism, which now makes us so revulsed by it, was their attempt to wipe out a complete people. The fun solution, as it was called. What's the difference between that and people who now call for the obliteration of Israel, which nearly always immediately translates, even in the minds of people who I think are probably kidding themselves sometimes, actually deep down, I'm an anti-Semitic.
Mm.
People who are sitting on the fence on this understand this is the pointy end of the
So,
collapse of a civilization that no longer understands how to differentiate between good and evil, confuses good with evil and evil with good.
yeah, exactly. And it actually, more than just confusing, actually calls what is evil good. So anyone who could call what Hamas did as good, say, the rapist regime of Hamas perpetrated a level of violence that people who witnessed it and who've seen the video, the 48-minute video coming that the IDF has shown, said the level of violence, not even the Germans in the Holocaust perpetrated that level of sheer barbarism. Now, the question for me, which is interesting, I think you were heading in this direction, the most virulent anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment comes from the left and also from Islam. And there's this unholy alliance. And I think the handful of pathetic neo-Nazis are just an easy straw man that everyone says the real concern is the far right and, neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. Not at all. I mean, Islam, and this is an interesting thought, and I don't know how we do this as a country, but Islam has baked into it from the prophet on a strand of anti-Semitism. And as you alluded to earlier, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was a close ally of Hitler's. And there's an iconic photograph of the two of them sitting down and talking. So Arab nationalism and jihadist Islam hate the Jews, hate the state of Israel. And now the left, with its anti-colonial, anti-settler, Jews, all white people are bad, Jews are white, therefore they're bad, and Israel's bad. It's this diabolical connection. So how do we address that in Australia without being guilty of the same kind of intolerance and hatred based on religion or ideas that we see on the other side?
It's a very good question. I think to some extent, and again, Douglas Murray makes this point, I think you are seeing a certain sort of absolutely committed group of people out on the fringes who so loathe Western culture. Unfortunately, they hold a surprising amount of cultural heft. There are a lot of them now, plainly. And I mean, there's just no other way of putting this. In the media, in entertainment, we've seen that, in politics, and I have to say, in business leadership, who are ambivalent at best or hold particularly odious views. And so you do have a problem. Their objective seems to be to tear us down on any port in a storm, anybody who will help them on that journey. Okay. I do think that there is still a massive resistance, though, to this sort of elite opinion. I think we saw it with The Voice in Australia. And I'm hoping that people will be truly shocked, as they have been in America. The loss of prestige by three of its major universities because its presidents could not clearly condemn anti-Semitism at the same time as they allowed all sorts of other outrageous behaviours to be defended on their campus. I think that has shocked the American people to the core. it should shock Australians to the core, to go back to the example I used a moment ago. Why is it okay to say we will unmask para-Nazis? I'm not against that. I think that'd be a good thing. I think it's absolutely shocking. But why is it that all of this elaborate architecture supposed to keep us safe from everything from somebody shooting a pea shooter right through to somebody saying something vaguely offensive, is that you're going to have people celebrating what Hamas stands for, tears of joy flowing down their faces. If that's not incitement to hatred and to violence, the sort of things that all of this elaborate legal architecture governments have set up is not designed to sort of help us confront what is. What is? Where's the political leadership? And
Well,
let me
it's
say, I should just say this. I made the point at the very beginning. It is everyone's right to criticize Israel and the Israeli government. Many Israelis themselves do. But keep in mind, it's a democracy, the only one there. There are only 16 million Jews or so around the world today. There will be many who have part Jewish blood, probably, over and above that, but only 16 million. There are hundreds of millions of Arabs. And like the Christian world, I think Alexander Downer made this point. There's around 85 plus countries that are nominally or at least foundationally were Christian. There's over 50 that are Islamic. There is one Jewish state. Guess which state we all say should be abolished, should be, from the Jordan to the sea, wiped out, the Jews. If that's not anti-Semitic, I don't know what is. After what the world, or what Germany did, and what the rest of the world frankly failed to face up to until it was so late and they saw the extermination camps, and after what, frankly, Arab leadership got up to in the Second World War, entering into early stage plans. They were thwarted, yes, but the plans were there to export their Jews to the gas camps. Surely we owe them one safe place. And they built a prosperous, free, smallish democracy surrounded by people who hate them. Living standards are way higher than any of their neighbours. Opportunities for young people are way higher. They actually have Arabs living in their society and in their parliament. They have allowed Gazans, and by the way, Gazan's not an occupied country. It hasn't been since 2005, and they were given free elections. Who did the Gazans elect? Hamas. What did Hamas immediately set about doing? Just like the Nazis, grabbing all power. What did they do then? They built an unbelievably complex military arrangement, tunnels, and massively complicated underground network under schools, under hospitals. What do they do with the UN money designed to ensure their kids got schooling? Made sure those schools indoctrinated them in the hatred of the Jews. Is any of this known and understood in the broader community? Where my plea to people who are still wondering what to make of all of this is wake up and see how the propaganda machine has gone into overtime. To those who are inclined to blindly think, oh, the poor Palestinians, ask yourself, does the Jewish state, are you saying it doesn't have a right to exist? If you acknowledge it has a right to exist, just like we say Australia has a right to exist, is it not entitled to take such measures as to secure its safety? And here's the biggest question of all. Is it not simply the case that, just as the case was for German citizens being bombed during the war, that the people who can quickest and most rapidly stop that pain, not actually the Jewish any more than it was the British and the Americans and the Australians during the Second World War, it's Hamas. Just as Berlin could have stopped the violence like that if it had recognised that it is engaging in unspeakable evils.
it that point is so powerful, and I think I've lost a bunch of friends online by trying to make exactly that point. Whenever I see someone saying we ceasefire now, I'm like, the people who could stop the killing instantly are Hamas. Release all the hostages, surrender, and make peace with Israel, and the killing would stop. Why do you think it is, John, that our political leaders here in Australia and the political leaders in our sort of civilizational orbit aren't every day pressuring the Arab leaders to force Hamas to surrender and release the hostages? Do you know there are 8 American citizens held hostage in the tunnels in Gaza? They're dual Israeli-American citizens. It's the single greatest hostage crisis that the United States has had since the Tehran crisis in 1979. How often does the Biden administration talk about the need to free the hostages their own people from Hamas. Why? Why this silence from our political leaders? Why is there not global pressure on Hamas to surrender and to support Israel without saying it's perfect? No one, you know, it's not perfect. You and I know that. No one's perfect, as you've already said so eloquently. What's going on in our political class that there is this staggering silence?
I'm I'm going to say to you, I think, firstly, I'd make the point that not all political leaders have been silent or lacking in courage on this. Um, I think there are some people who have been extremely brave, and that, including former prime ministers and foreign ministers. And there are current serving people who have been very brave. And I actually think, for example, the Premier of New South Wales has displayed more courage than any other Labor leader in the country. And good on him. Good on him. He's a
Yep.
man, I think, who has a moral compass, and he's
Can
exercising it.
I
But more
can I
broadly,
just jump in? No, I just want to jump in before you go on. You say that it's brave. Tell me, why do we think it's brave to denounce barbaric terrorism and stand on the side of one of our staunchest allies?
uh, well, I'll tell you why. For base political reasons, many people are looking at the fact that we have large numbers of people in our electorate, particularly people from that part of the world, who actually hate Israel. Now, that's a particular form of courage, of a lack of courage. So
Mm.
you can call out para-Nazis or, neo-Nazis, because everybody, there's enough historical memory to remember what evils they got up to.
Yeah.
But, oh no, where's the condemnation by those people, and some of them, frankly, who hold quite a bit of political power? And this is true in America. There are a number, even in the presidential race, there are a number of states where the Arab vote might be important. Now, the point I want to make about this is, where are the Arab nations? Why have we not noticed that none of the Arab nations want to actually help the Gazans, the Palestinians? Where is Egypt? Where's Lebanon? Where's Jordan? There's a problem, and the Muslim world knows it, in my view, and they ought to be a little more honest about this. They're pretty good, it seems, at creating mayhem where they go. So while they're busily condemning Israel, they're not exactly saying the Palestinians are lovely people and we'd welcome them into our midst. We'll help them. We'll take them in, as refugees and what have you. And again, on Hamas, surely we've got enough evidence now to know that they are the ones who have been blocking humanitarian aid. And I, for one, find it extraordinary in this, the debate in the media about both sidism. Why does it, when it comes to casualty numbers, we're only getting one sidism? It's from Hamas. Does anybody think Hamas might actually have an interest in pumping up the numbers? Does anybody actually think Hamas might have an interest in downplaying the horrors of what happened on the 7th? And I just wonder how many Australians, how would we react if we had a terrorist cell that had wiped out, proportionately it would be what, not 1,200 people, it would be 4,000 or 5,000. We had all of those gross, unbelievable images. I mean, what are we saying, that they're made up? I mean, I heard the other day that, Israel planned all of this. Really? Against their own people? Come on. How naive are we? How gullible are we? But then how would we react to the idea that we'd had a terrorist in our midst who'd got on the phone and said, "Hey, Mama, you got to be proud of your boy. I've just slaughtered 10 young Australians." How would we feel? Would that galvanise us? And what's the difference between 10 young Australians in the end and 10 young Israelis? So how are they meant to respond? There will be no peace until Hamas is destroyed. So why is the world not committed to ensuring that Hamas is not in a position again to slaughter people everywhere, including, because I actually think morally, I think they are culpable for the deaths of the people they say they care about, the Palestinians. And we might have a little more belief in their protestations if we'd seen them actually facilitating aid, if we'd seen them using all those tunnels to find safety. if we'd seen them being given access to the water and the fuel that they needed, that Hamas had been stockpiling, it appears with some of our money, how naive are we, for quite some time, so that they could put, sort of push all
Mm.
of us forward.
Well, it always strikes me that y- when rockets come into Gaza, Hamas locks the civilians out of their tunnels, and their military hide in the tunnels, protected by bomb-proof tunnels and civilians above. Whereas in Israel, when rockets come, the civilians run and hide in bomb shelters, and the military goes in and puts their lives at risk to attack the ones who are perpetrating the evil. So vastly different strategies. It seems very hard, though, for Israel to win this propaganda war, because I can't tell you the number of lovely Christian people when I start having this conversation. Immediately they start talking about all the innocent Gazans, and I make the point. I don't know if you've thought about this, that in fact the ratio of combatants to civilians being killed in Gaza is the lowest ratio of any urban warfare that has occurred in living memory. So somewhere in the order of 1.5 civilians, even on Hamas's own numbers, kill for every one Hamas combatant killed. That's extraordinarily low in an incredibly difficult situation. So I say to people, well, what else can the IDF do? What else can Israel do? I don't know if you've had conversations like that, or how you'd encourage people to just think about these things a little more rationally and realistically.
I have had those conversations. And of course, sometimes they revert back to the innocent, uh, inverted commas, Germans and Japanese who died
Yeah.
in the fight against real genocide, a real attempted genocide in the Second World War. Um, and that is the problem. War is horrific. War is horrible. It is evil. But
Mhm.
I think the question that I put to those people is, well, what do you expect the Israelis to do? Are you saying they should allow themselves to be wiped off the earth? Because until Hamas is gone, they are not safe. They walked. People forget this. Israel has not occupied Gaza since 2005. Perhaps in a way, they were naive not to sort of be a little more alert to what was really being built, the most elaborate
Mm.
guerrilla warfare mechanisms ever designed, and designed in a way to make certain that there would be massive civilian casualties if Israel sought to defend itself. And we've fallen for it. Doesn't excuse the barbarity of it, but you've got to ask yourself, who started? Does Israel have a right to defend itself? Are any of us safe if the Middle East
Mm.
turns into a meltdown? I mean, what are we going to do if Israel does cease to exist? What then? What
Yeah.
then? What'll be involved? Where will it lead to? And lastly, does anybody really believe that this would have happened if Hamas had not butchered people in a way that, as I said at the beginning, and I think this is so important, to do that to the Jewish people who suffered the Holocaust and all of the other persecutions down through the ages means that we have I'll put this bluntly, an absolute moral responsibility to recognize it impacts them in a way that it
Mm.
doesn't impact people like me who have no Jewish heritage.
So that takes us back to Australia, it seems to me, and you think, well, um, uh, people here try to make a distinction between Zionism and anti-Semitism. Well, I don't. I I support the Jews. They're just like any other people. They should be free from oppression. But what's happening in Israel is terrible. Do you think that's a legitimate separation? And how do we navigate that?
It is a hard one, but I think at the very first, you've got to say, well, why do Jews not feel safe in Australia anymore? Do you think it might be because you've not recognized what they're being subjected to? Do you think it might be because overwhelmingly, not completely, but I do think the media and many of our elite cultural institutions have been pretty weak in their defense of the Jews? and they'd been surprisingly strong, whether it's marching in the streets, whether it's solidarity on Australia Day with whatever, with
Mm,
causes that, well, they're pretty dependent on propaganda, I'd have to say. And we've
mm,
lost our discernment. We have lost our discernment. That's the point about the G.K. Chesterton quote. We are starting to
yeah.
believe anything. It's not just on the Jewish question. We see it everywhere. People believing things that the minute you start to test them don't stand up. Critical theory being
Mm,
one of them.
mm.
Um, but it's I don't think you can separate. If it was just about Israel, you would not see the rise in anti-Semitism. That's probably the shortest way I can put it.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere, particularly
It's
this time. It used
interesting.
to be the right wing, and now it's
Yeah.
probably still the extreme right wing. But this time it's being particularly driven by the so-called progressive classes.
Some listeners may not know this, but my mother was a refugee from the Holocaust. And so, I mean, this is incredibly incredibly personal. I've never felt the sort of the epigenetic effects of the horror. I grew up in my family. The shadow of the Shoah, the ghosts of pogroms past, just live in our family memory and in my heart. So almost every Jewish person I speak to has the experience, even here in Australia, and it's true for me. I've come out from behind the pulpit as an Anglican pastor and taken a very public stance. Um, to support the Jewish people in Sydney. And that's been partly coming out of my identity, but partly just out of common decency. But in as much as I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust as a Jewish person, what seems interesting to me is in Australia, that generation of men who risked and lost their lives to fight anti Semitic evil, who fought the Germans and the Japanese and gave their lives, and then came back to Australia, sort of built into us an Australia an awareness of right and wrong and what really mattered, and an awareness of the horrors of anti Semitism. That generation's gone. Their children have largely forgotten that, and their grandchildren are marching in the streets supporting Hamas and the Houthis. It's insane that that generational transmission of knowledge seems not to have happened, and we missed that and we've lost that.
I genuinely believe this has a great deal to do. It's been quite intentional amongst many academic elites who, in their own language, their language, not mine, began their long march through the institution in the 1950s in
Yeah.
America. Their language, not mine. And it is evident that either the ignoring of history or the teaching of it in revisionist ways or with agendas has been used to deprive people of that knowledge. I am a historian and I grew up in a time when history was properly taught at Sydney University, but I also grew up in the shadow of war. This is what my father looked like during the Second World War. This is an Australian digger dressed in the clobber that went with being a member of the 9th Division. He was literally given up for dead. One of those people who said the doctors won't live, leave him. Don't leave. Anyway, he pulled through just. So there was that deep awareness of the horrors of war and of the unbelievable price people paid to bring evil to heel. I want to say that I believe what Hamas is doing and what they represent is evil. I want to say the same of the other terrorist groups, many of them backed by Iran, deeply committed as it is to the obliteration of Israel, are likewise of a nature that can only be confronted by force. They have to be disposed of in the same way that those responsible for the gassing of the Jews during the Second World War were. That level of hatred destroys everything. It certainly destroys democracy. And again, I say, were the children marching in Melbourne aware that Israel is a vibrant democracy where people who have different views on life actually allowed to prosper and to take opportunity in their lands? Why this moral equivalence between terrorism and free democracies, for a start, at its most basic level? What is going on here? And then the next question immediately is, should that free democracy have the right to exist? And if it doesn't, why should Australia have a right to exist? Well, that
Yep.
takes us straight back to the mindset of the people who don't think we should in our own midst. And I say, I want to live in peace. I want my children and my grandchildren to live in peace. This sort of hatred spreading across the globe and now deeply enmeshed in sections of the Australian community only put risk. They do not enhance our future security and well-being and existence as a peaceful nation.
Uh, Here's the question for you then. The events of October 7 seem to me to have shone a bright light on the profound divisions in our culture with radical Islam and the radical left, so at odds with mainstream Australia and who we are. Do we have enough social cohesion in Australia to actually to survive, to build, to are there enough young people who would go to war to protect Australia, and to go to war, maybe not literally, but go to war at the universities and in the classrooms in the battle of ideas, and realistically, you said this, the defense. Is there enough social cohesion? And if not, what can we do about it?
Well, I would certainly say that I know some very, very impressive young Australians who I think would stand for freedom. But I think many have been allowed themselves to be deeply indoctrinated. I am reminded of the so-called Oxford Pledge. Oxford in February
Mm.
1933, cold, bitter. Oxford Union debated the motion that this country would, that we would not die, under no circumstances would this house die for king and country. In other words, our culture is not worth defending. And Churchill was always very worried that that encouraged Hitler to think that Britain had given up believing on itself, that its youth would not defend itself. Only a few short years ago, they were flying Spitfires, and Hurricanes all over London and dying in the desert and tackling the evils of Nazism in a way that we think of as, in many ways, their finest hour. And so I think the answer is we don't know, but we mustn't give up. And I know
Mm.
that I've used some firm language today, but I would ask people to understand that it comes from a place of deep conviction that we must learn the lessons of history,
Mm.
unbridled hatred, unbridled racism, because despite all the nonsense, no, let me rephrase that. Despite the endless talk about the evils of racism in our society by the elites, it is plain that many of them are either complicit in the ugliest and oldest form of racism of all, or they're ambivalent about it and not prepared to stand against it. I make that charge, and I regard it as a very serious charge. I would like to see a proper response, an intelligent one, not the sort of trolling that goes on at the moment that you and I know all about. That's horrible and it works its power in some quarters. But if we're serious people intent upon securing our future, we've got to rise above that and ask for some real explanations from the people who are ambivalent about this. And the biggest question of all, I think, is do you really think there can be any peace for Israel or indeed for the uh, Gazan people themselves until Hamas is completely emasculated? And if
Mm.
so, please show us the way because
Yeah.
I can't see it.
One of the things that I'm working on is and finding hard is we formed a coalition of people called Never Again Is Now, which is a Christian-led movement to try and mobilize Christians to stand against this racism and this hatred. And as you were saying, it just sparked in me this realization. I I think there is deep racism baked. It's a tribal condition of evil that we sort of this tendency in us, but gosh, it's so close to the surface, and this particular hatred of Jewish people that has emerged. I'm finding it quite hard to mobilize the church to say, of all people, we follow a Jewish savior. Of all people, we should abhor racism and we should stand against the group who's being most clearly persecuted in our country at the moment, which is the Jewish people. Uh, what would you say to your Christian, because you're a man of deep faith, what would you say to your Christian sisters and brothers about their response to Jewish people and to anti-Semitism and to hate at this moment in history in Australia?
I think I would say, please think long and read widely, think deeply, make sure you really do understand the term of genocide and what it means, and who it is who's openly advocating genocide here, and why we must be prepared to stand against that sort of hatred.
Do you think, well, what do you make of then the Christian history of anti-Semitism? I mean, in the name of Jesus, the church has perpetrated some awful, awful things in the past. Um, how do we ensure that doesn't happen again? How do we what do we have to do for Christians to go, hey, we have a particular responsibility for our complicity and silence and apathy and sometimes active uh, perpetration of genocide in the past, or anti-Semitism in the past. What do we need to see in the churches to address this?
Well, again, I think history is important. You've just touched on a very important point there. Prior to the Second World War, there was an awful lot of moral ambiguity going on. People saying, oh, no, that can't be true. And oh, no, we can't help. As Western nations, including our own, refused to take refugees when it was emerging that the Nazi regime was intent upon being unbelievably savage. We didn't know about the gas chambers then, but we knew how bad it
Mm.
was. So, yes, there's a degree of complicity. How did it end up? It did not end up in a good place. Moral ambivalence never does.
Hmm.
I'm not a theologian competent. I'm really not to delve into some of these matters too deeply. But I would make this point: a responsibility to recognize that every soul is equal in the eyes of heaven, as Robert Menzies put it, is a very deep one. But in so recognizing, we do have to have a capacity to say that when there is a wanton disregard of that respect for other human beings, there are times when the terrible option of war is lesser than the alternative evil. And we learnt that to huge cost between 1939 and 1945, enormous. As I mentioned, I grew up in the shadow of a man
Mm.
who'd been through it. Um, we don't want to learn it again. Somehow or other, this is a terrible mistake that we've made, and I think we fall into, frankly, even in Christian circles. We forget that human nature is flawed and that it doesn't change. Every individual is a mixture, if you like, of the glory and the scum, but sometimes the scum so dominates and is so dangerous to other people. And remember that in the eyes of most terrorists, Israel's only the little Satan. The big Satan's America and the rest of the West. And we
Mm.
can see that. We've imported people into our midst who hate us. We have to be blunt
You
about that, who absolutely hate us and hate our way of life. We must stand against that sort of hatred. And
well,
we're not to take the law into our own hands, but our governments should on our behalf. They should have great moral clarity around these things. And they should be looking firstly to what is right, secondly to what is right, and thirdly what is right, not just their own political calculations.
so here's a thought for you. When you see some of the Islamic sheikhs, the sheikhs in the western parts of Sydney, have had a series of sermons over the last few months. I'm sure you haven't been listening to them. I've listened to a few, and the friends have been, a good friend of mine's doing a thorough analysis of them. But it's very clear they're calling for jihad and the overthrow of the Australian government and the imposition of Sharia law. The Islamic rule in Australia is the clear agenda. What do you think about, instead of going on about hate speech, that actually what we need is legislation to against sedition? Any call for intifada or jihad, in fact, is a call for the overthrow of our government, and perhaps that's what we need to stand against and say, this of all things needs to be prosecuted?
I don't have an easy answer. I just made the observation that the unbelievably top-heavy and expensive architecture we've put in place to protect ourselves from one another, we compete for our human rights in this country. Everybody has protection except the religious. There's no religious freedom legislation, despite promises now for 7 or 8 years from both sides of politics.
Yeah,
Tells you something
yeah.
pretty powerful in itself. But that architecture is now proving to be useless. The politicians are starting to acknowledge it. They're starting to acknowledge that it is extraordinary that we can live in a country where a woman's carted off in her pajamas in handcuffs in front of her children, for protesting COVID. But, apparently it's all right to incite people to join in a global campaign to wipe a people off the face of the earth. I don't know that I can put it much more starkly than that. What more do we need to convince us? And so probably we do need a debate about where we've gone because, we talk about ourselves as a successful multicultural society, perhaps the most successful on it. But there's a point of, if multiculturalism means multi-values, are we saying that all values are the same? That the values of jihadism are the same as the golden rule, do unto your neighbor as you'd have them do unto yourself? Are they moral equivalents? Really? Come on.
Mm. We need to choose what set of values, what worldview we're going to inhabit, and how we are then going to live in the light of that. Um, it feels to me there are dark days ahead of us. And part of what I experience, I was thinking about this as you spoke, is the people don't want to engage and think about this because it all feels too scary and overwhelming. And somehow if I just get on with my life and I treat everyone nicely, then they'll all be nice to me. And it's just too hard to think about this. So how do you maintain your hope and optimism and joy in these dark days and in the middle of everything we're going through and the choices ahead of us?
Well, I feel as a believer, I cannot give up. I never give up. I can never afford it. It's just not an option open to me. I need to keep making the case as best I can. I need to plead with people whenever I have the opportunity to think carefully through these things at one level. So that's the theological, if you like, commitment to a fellow human being. I think at another level, I have enjoyed an extraordinary life because I've stood on the shoulders of people that fought and defended freedom for me, and I want to do the same for the next generation. I think at another level, Australia was woefully and willfully turning a blind eye in the 1930s to what was building. It's very interesting, they weren't in the early days of federation. The Australian people were very exercised about the coming global meltdown. They didn't know what it would look like, but they were. The evidence of that really is in the extraordinary navy that sailed through Sydney Heads in 1913, just in time to secure Australia from the Germans that were everywhere in the Pacific at the time, and then we sent Anzacs off after that. But in the 1930s, much more like now, all the evidence of trouble is around us. But no
Mm.
one did anything until the war broke out, and we suddenly discovered that we didn't even have any submarine defence against people sinking our shipping, and we had no effective defence against invasion, Darwin being bombed. We were willfully refusing to sort of grapple with what was really happening. I sincerely believe that Australians are beginning to think we've lost it. They've got to take the next step now and start to say, actually, this really matters, and I want to stand up and be counted. And it might be as simple as coming to a rally in support of Israel's right to exist. Not to say it's perfect, not to say we agree with its government of the day, not to say that we don't think it's made mistakes, but to say, firstly, it's there for sound historical reasons. It really is. Secondly, we have a right, I think, absolute responsibility, given all of our failings in the 1930s in particular, to defend a homeland for the Jewish people, the only one they've got. when all the rest of us have one. And I think, thirdly, to say that propaganda of the sort that completely reverses the truth and says that it's Israel. I mean, goodness, the South Africans failed in their bid. Let's face it. Even they couldn't convince the International Court in The Hague. I mean, they couldn't convince them. I don't know what that means to the progressives because they love that court, and even it sort of said, "No, we can't call on a ceasefire." Um, we've got to be realistic here. If you have a better solution for ending the reign of terror, we'd love to hear it. If you haven't, then at least acknowledge the Jewish people's right to a homeland, because our forebears, this is a very important point, they agonized over it for a long, long time. It was not taken lightly, but there were real reasons, I believe, for them saying there have been Jews in the Middle East forever. They are entitled to a modest little homeland in that vast area, geographically and in terms of the numbers of the other countries in the region, just something that they can call their home. To deny that, I think, means that you've immediately got to show why you're not playing to anti-Semitism.
Well, John, uh, I want to thank you, and I find it hard to speak as somebody who's Jewish and a follower of Jesus, and who loves this country and who loves our civilization and has benefited enormously. And I want our civilization to flourish. I want my kids and my grandkids and my great grandkids to enjoy and grow up in this kind of environment. But as a Jewish person, on behalf of the Jewish people, to the extent I can speak on behalf of them, I want to thank you for your great moral clarity in the words you've spoken today. And I hope they have a broad listenership. I hope lots of people listen to what you've said and take it on board and take it to heart, because uh, I can't tell you how alone so many Jewish people feel. And in this sea of moral relativism and appeasement and trying to be kind, but actually in the end being terribly cruel to the Jewish people, what you've just said is incredibly moving, and needs to be said. So thank you so much. And there will be uh, people whose lives are deeply impacted by these words for good. And I'm so glad you're coming out. And on the 18th of February, you'll get to say these words, hopefully in front of tens of thousands of Sydney-siders who hear your rally cry and come out with us to say, no, anti-Semitism has no place in Australia. This is not who we are. This is not the kind of culture we want. And we can stand with great moral clarity on the side of justice and truth. So I just want to thank you. I don't have anything else to say. I guess, how do you wrap up these things? But bless you and thank you. And the fight is long, but we're on the right side. So that's it.